Okay, today we're gonna try something new. I'm gonna tell you a story about a legendary rock that I cannot find. Normally when this kind of thing happens, I just scrap the video or turn it into like a 45-second clip in some kind of compilation. But maybe that's the wrong thing to do. Because if I still make the video, then maybe one day somebody can take the info that I was able to find and use that and go out and find the rock for themselves. Or maybe I just put a ton of time and effort into finding this stone and I'm nakedly falling for the sunk cost fallacy by still trying to make a video about it. Either way, I feel like we better set a brisk pace on this one, so let's keep it moving. Here is a passage from a letter that the famous horror and science fiction writer H.P. Lovecraft sent to a friend back in October of 1930. In the letter, Lovecraft mentions Witch Rock, a cursed boulder hidden away near Hopkins Hill in the Rhode Island countryside. According to Lovecraft, a witch once made her home near the boulder back in the 1600s, and even today, her presence can still be felt near the stone. If a farmer tries to plow the land around the rock, then their plow will break with seemingly no explanation. And some people even say that the old witch still lives near the boulder nowadays, hidden away in the shape of a crow or a cat, avoiding detection in a secret underground burrow. It's a pretty interesting story, right? Like, I read that and I thought that would be a perfect topic for a video. The only thing I had to do was go out and find out where the stone is. So I started looking and researching, and right away I found this newspaper article published in the New York Sun back in 1885. The article is about a witch's rock near Hopkins Hill in Rhode Island, so clearly this is the same legend that Lovecraft was talking about. The big difference, though, is that the article's version of the story is way longer and way more detailed. So let's dive in. After a short introduction, the New York Sun journalist says that they heard the story from an aged Rhode Islander. And then they lay out the whole legend in quotation marks, so you know it's for real. A couple hundred years ago, according to the Rhode Islander, when European colonists first started to settle down near Hopkins Hill, a witch moved in nearby and started causing all kinds of trouble. Tools would mysteriously disappear. Livestock would come down with strange illnesses. And worst of all, the witch placed a curse on a great boulder situated right near the settlers' farmland. For 100 yards around the stone, it was impossible to work the land. If somebody tried to plow near the rock, the plow would fall apart right in front of them. For generations, things carried on this way. Nobody could break the witch's curse. Until finally, in the late 1700s, a man named Reynolds got real tired of having to tiptoe around the witch's cursed boulder. So he grabbed his plow and he told the whole community that he was going to work that enchanted field once and for all. Twice, the plow broke down on Reynolds, falling apart seemingly by magic. And just as he was getting ready to give it a go for a third time, a great big crow comes flying overhead. The crow passed over the field and then changed right in front of everyone from a bird to an old woman with a crooked hat. Clearly, this was the witch. So off went a crowd of men in pursuit of the witch, chasing her all the way up to the cursed boulder where the woman turned into a cat and dove underneath the stone. For hours, the men dug away under the rock, but never did they find the witch. Finally, she had seemed to disappear for good. Still, though, her power lingered. Although the woman's house near the rock crumbled into ruins, the land around the boulder still refused to be farmed. And so, over time, a great mass of bushes and weeds grew to swallow up the boulder and hide away its secret. Although, even today, you can still identify Witch's Rock by the furrow surrounding the stone, a trench around the rock dug out by the men's shovels as they desperately tried to unearth the witch. And that's the story. That is a ton of good information, right? In addition to a much more fleshed out narrative, we also have a way better idea of what to look for. Like, we already knew that Witch Rock was near Hopkins Hill, but now we also know that it might be near the ruins of some kind of old house, because the witch supposedly used to live in a structure right near the rock, so maybe we can find like the cellar or foundation of the building. And even more crucially, we also know to look for a furrow or a trench circling the rock. The article mentions this specifically as the stone's defining feature, and if the trench was still visible in 1885, I think there's a good chance that it might still be there today. Now, you might be thinking at this point, hey, if the story started back in the late 1600s, then shouldn't we be using an older source? Like, why are we leaning so much on an article from 1885, literally centuries after the witch supposedly first enchanted the boulder? Well, surprisingly, this is actually the oldest source that I could find on this story. And very interestingly, it's also a very popular source on the story, at least way back in the day. See, after this article first appeared in the New York Sun in June of 1885, it was reprinted all across the country in dozens of newspapers, everywhere from Georgia to California to South Dakota. And after that mass distribution, the story of Witch's Rock started to appear in other places too, like this book of folktales called Myths and Legends of Our Own Land, published back in 1896. Or this book about the culture and history of Rhode Island from 1906, or this book from 1907, or this book from 1927. All of these books tell an almost identical story to the one published in the New York Sun, and some of them even just straight up reprint the story verbatim. So if you ask me, I think it's very likely that the New York Sun article was kind of the genesis of all of these books, including that story, and that is probably how Lovecraft ended up learning about it in 1930. Like maybe he read the tale of Witch's Rock in a copy of the Narragansett Country or something like that. But all that said, I definitely don't want to make it sound like the books add nothing to the narrative. They're not complete carbon copies, or at least not all of them are. Some of them do make some small changes or throw in a couple of extra details. The most important of which being the method for which you identify the rock. See, remember how the New York Sun article said that you can recognize Witch's Rock by the great big furrow or trench that's dug out around the boulder? Well, according to this book from 1896, the furrow is actually in the rock itself. It's not in the ground. Apparently, one of the settlers hit the rock with a shovel and knocked out a chunk. And later on, by 1907, the story has changed even more. Now the farmer broke the rock not with a shovel, but with the actual plow, which is quite a big change. Instead of a trench around the boulder, now we're supposed to be looking for a chip in the stone, which I think is quite a lot harder to look for. But still, it seems like we finally got enough to go on here, right? Like maybe it's time that we head on out to Hopkins Hill and try and find the boulder. Well, funny thing about Hopkins Hill, nowadays it is owned by a sand company who has mostly blasted the top off the hill. Yeah, Hopkins Hill is situated right about here in West Greenwich, Rhode Island, and as you can see from this time lapse on Google Earth, slowly but surely the sand company has worked through more and more of the hill. What a disappointment, right? Like when I saw that, I thought the hunt for Witch's Rock was dead right then and there. Very high chance that the stone had already been destroyed by the sand company. It seemed pretty pointless to go out and look for the rock. But then I noticed something kind of strange about that first New York Sun newspaper article that kicked this whole thing off. See, in the article and its reprints, the Rhode Islander refers to Hopkins Hill as a neighborhood, and the journalist calls it a beautiful village in western Rhode Island, which is kind of strange because Hopkins Hill is not a village, and it's not a neighborhood, and it's not the name of any kind of settlement. It's just the name of a hill. So why is it being referred to as a village by both the journalist and the Rhode Islander? Maybe it's because the newspaper got the name wrong. maybe the location of Witch's Rock isn't actually Hopkins Hill, but instead an actual village with a similar sounding name. If you've been watching my videos for a while, then you know that this kind of thing is not uncommon at all. And besides, the journalist doesn't even tell us how they heard this story from the aged Rhode Islander. Like, maybe it was told to them verbally once and they just wrote the name down wrong. And wouldn't you know it, there actually are a few villages in Rhode Island with names similar to Hopkins Hill. 3 worth mentioning to be exact. The first is Hopkins Hollow in western Rhode Island, which unfortunately doesn't seem to have any kind of real connection to Witch Rock, at least any connection that I could find. The second village, though, is a lot more interesting. Hopkinton in southern Rhode Island actually does have a connection to our cursed boulder. Check out this book from 1945 about the culture and history of rural New England. According to this, there used to be a witch named Granny Mott who lived on Hopkins Hill in Hopkinton. And supposedly, Granny Mott once cursed a big rock in the middle of a field so that no farmer could work the land without breaking their plow. Sounds very familiar, right? The book doesn't actually say Witch's Rock, but that is pretty much the exact same story right down to Hopkins Hill. So at first glance, this might seem like confirmation that Witch's Rock is actually in Hopkinton, right? But I think there's a little more here than meets the eye. Like, for one, Hopkins Hill in Hopkinton doesn't exist. That is not a real place. And for two, the legend of Granny Mott is actually a totally separate witch story that traditionally has nothing to do with an enchanted boulder. Like, check this out. Here's a newspaper article from 1867 that tells the real story. I'm not going to go through this entire thing, but the legend here has zero relation to Witch's Rock at all. The short version is that it's a story about a bird annoying a whole bunch of people in Hopkinton, and then a farmer eventually shoots the bird with a silver bullet, and it's revealed to be Granny Mott in animal form in disguise the entire time. Absolutely nothing to do with a cursed rock. So if you ask me, this book from 1945 is just an author kind of getting confused and mashing two Rhode Island witch legends together. I guess it's possible that Witch Rock has some kind of connection to Hopkinton. It's certainly not out of the question by any means. So if you do want to pick up where I left off, then maybe don't ignore that thread entirely, but still pretty unlikely, at least in my opinion. And so finally, now we come to the last village with a name that sounds like Hopkins Hill, and that is Hopkins Mills in western Rhode Island. This one is far and away the most interesting, and not just because Hopkins Mills sounds a whole lot like Hopkins Hill. See, one of the first things that I did when I learned about the village of Hopkins Mills was to start looking at old maps of the village for some kind of clue. And one of the maps that I found was this hand-drawn map from 1947 that very clearly points out a place called Witch Hill that's kinda sorta near Hopkins Mills. Now, this isn't a smoking gun or anything, because pretty much every town in New England has some kind of witch legend, but still, this was definitely encouraging to see. And so, I started trying to research Witch Hill, and right away, I found this book from 2013, Legends, Lore, and Secrets of New England. And this book is really remarkable because it straight up claims to have found Witch Rock. Or to be more accurate, it just kind of talks about Witch Rock as if its location was never even in question in the first place. So, according to the book, Witch Rock is in Foster, Rhode Island, which is the town that the village of Hopkins Mills is in, and it's on Witch Hill, and Witch Hill apparently used to be called Hopkins Hill. And the book even includes a picture of Witch Rock that I'm not going to show you because the photo is probably copyrighted, although I can tell you that it does have a little chip in the stone that the authors claim is the spot where the settlers hit the rock with their shovels. Again, the authors present all of this information as if it's like conclusively known, which is like very surprising to me, because this is the only source that I've been able to find that points to one rock as definitively which rock. And so I have to admit that I'm a little bit distrusting of that. Like, I actually drove over to Witch Hill myself, and as you can see, there are rocks everywhere in the area. I really don't know how the authors of the book picked out just one of these stones as the definitive witch rock. And also, the book says that Witch Rock is supposedly at the very, 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 very tippy top of Witch Hill, which would be quite surprising to me, considering the original article says in the neighborhood of Hopkins Hill and not at the very top of Hopkins Hill, which is what I would definitely say if I was talking about something that was at the literal peak of a hill. And the idea that Hopkins Hill had its name changed to Witch Hill is kind of far-fetched to me, because I looked through about 100 different old maps of the area trying to see if the hill was ever called Hopkins Hill, and I never once found anything that even was remotely close to evidence of the name change. And also, the entire reason that I started looking in this area in the first place is because I thought that Hopkins Hill might be a misprint of Hopkins Mills. But if it's not a misprint, then according to the 2013 book, there were 2 Hopkins Hills in Rhode Island, and one of them just changed to Witch Hill later. And if that's the case, then how can we be sure that the legend is talking about the one in Hopkins Mills and not the one that the sand company owns? And the book also makes no mention of the furrow or the trench that's supposed to be visible around the rock, and instead they use the identifier that was added in like later versions of the story, which is the chip in the stone that was supposedly caused by the plow or the shovels. And to me, that seems a little bit strange that we're only using the new identifier and ignoring the older one. So I guess what I'm trying to say is if you add all that together, I'm just not feeling particularly convinced. Like, maybe the authors of the book actually did discover some kind of like ironclad evidence that Witch Hill used to be called Hopkins Hill, and maybe they actually did find some kind of like holy grail source that absolutely identifies exactly one boulder as Witch's Rock. But if that's the case, they didn't cite any of those sources, and they didn't explain at all where they got their information from. And so for now, I'm not ready to just trust the book, and I'm certainly not at all ready to close the case. So maybe they're right. Maybe they totally pinned it perfectly, and that is absolutely Witch's Rock in that picture, but I'm not convinced. Especially because right around here is where I noticed something else about that New York Sun article. Remember how the entire reason that we went off on this tangent in the first place is because I thought it was weird that the article was referring to Hopkins Hill as a village when it's really just a hill? Well, after I read through the article again, I noticed that it's really only the journalist who calls Hopkins Hill a village. The specific phrase that the Rhode Islander uses is "in the neighborhood of Hopkins Hill." So now that I'm looking at this again, I feel like what might have actually happened here is the journalist just misinterpreted the Rhode Islander. Because maybe the Rhode Islander meant in the neighborhood of Hopkins Hill, as in near Hopkins Hill. But the journalist thought that he meant literal neighborhood because the journalist is from New York, so he's probably not all that familiar with all the names of villages in Rhode Island. And so the journalist just started erroneously referring to Hopkins Hill as a literal neighborhood or literal village. So now I'm starting to feel like Witch's Rock probably actually is, or at least was, on the Hopkins Hill that's owned by the sand company. And now that I'm looking at the map again, I'm also noticing that most of the land around the sand company's land is actually public. So I can probably hike around most of it without technically trespassing. And you know what? Because the Rhode Islander said in the neighborhood of Hopkins Hill and not at the top of Hopkins Hill, like we talked about earlier, I'm thinking that maybe it doesn't actually matter that the sand company blew the top off the hill, because maybe Witch Rock is still somewhere on the existing slopes of the hill. And maybe I can go down there and take a look around and find that cursed stone. I can look for a boulder with about a 4-foot diameter that has a big furrow dug out around it that's near the ruins of an old structure. Maybe I really can locate Witch's Rock. Well, I couldn't. I tried and I failed, but if you want, you can watch me kinda go insane while I was looking. Okay, here we go. Let's see if we can find Witch's Rock, or Witch Rock, in somewhere around in the neighborhood of Hopkins Hill. I got a little ways to go to actually get to Hopkins Hill. I got to go by a gun range, and then I'm gonna be like skirting around the perimeter of a sand company for most of the day. So wish me luck. Okay, right here, we're coming up to a fantastic sign that we might be on the right track. An old stone wall in the middle of the New England woods. If you've seen a few of my previous videos, then you know that these stone walls are an indication that the land that we're standing on right here used to be farmland, which is exactly what the land was when the Witch Rock story supposedly happened. Also really increases the chances that we might find a foundation somewhere too, which is what we really need to ensure that we found the right rock. Here's a little pile of rocks on top of a big rock. That for sure was done by a human at some point in history. I can hear the sand company trucks and stuff. So I'm definitely in the neighborhood of Hopkins Hill now for sure. Okay, I just came across this rock a little ways off a trail that's very, very interesting, because it looks to me like it definitely does have somewhat of a trench dug around it. Like you could imagine that that little outcropping there was dug out by a person, right? And the effect is actually even more pronounced on this side. Look at that. Very clearly dug out under the rock here. Totally this could have been done by an animal too, but I think without a doubt this was dug away by somebody or something at some point. Like you could definitely imagine somebody with a shovel trying to dig this far in to get to a cat that ran under the rock, because that goes back probably, I don't know, 36 inches or so. That's quite a furrow underneath the edge of the rock. Okay, I'm editing the video now, and I just wanted to jump in real quick because watching this footage back in hindsight is very funny, and just seeing how excited I was and thinking that I actually had a shot to find Witch's Rock, and just seeing me freak out over a completely unimpressive furrow in the boulder as if I'm on the cusp of finding the rock and doing this full investigation of this boulder that is just clearly not Witch's Rock. So I guess this could be a candidate for Witch Rock. The only problem being it is way bigger than 4 feet in diameter. Like way bigger, as you can see. So I have a hard time believing that that original Rhode Islander who wrote in that letter would call this thing 4 feet in diameter when it's clearly like triple that size. And I've been walking around this area now for a little, and I've seen zero evidence of a house or a structure ever being here, which also makes it less likely that this is the right rock. No shovel or plow mark anywhere either, but like I said, I think that part might have been a later addition to the story and not something we should put too much stock in. By the way, if you're wondering where all these giant rocks came from, they're actually dropped here by glaciers. These big rocks that are just kind of haphazardly spread around the landscape were picked up in the north many thousands of years ago, drugged down here by glaciers, and then when the glaciers eventually melted or retreated, they just dropped the rocks right on the ground, and here they are today. Also, it being the winter makes bushwhacking a million times easier too, because this would be so much harder to walk through just a few months ago, but now it's easy peasy. By the way, the reason I'm wearing all this orange is because it's hunting season and this is a hunting area, so it's the law. I'm just walking off the trail towards every random rock I see. I don't think so. Well, here's something pretty cool. Piece of like the roof of a shack. Check this out. Here's something really cool. Look at how all these trees are lined up in a perfect row. See this? It just goes on and on with all these trees lined up perfectly. So that means that this was probably the edge of somebody's property and they planted these as windbreak trees. Sometimes when you see this, it can also be evidence that a place used to be a tree farm, but considering it's just this one row, and wow, this row actually goes on forever, like it keeps going and going, I'm gonna say almost definitely these are windbreak trees. Very cool. And also just found this trail out of the blue. Okay, I'm pretty much as close as you can be to the sand company now. I can hear them working very clearly. You know, the more I walk around here, the more I realize I don't really have all that much that I'm looking for. It kind of just feels like I'm in a I'll know it when I see it sort of situation. Okay, here's another rock that has a very clear little trench underneath it. And also, it's literally right next to the road that goes to the sand company. So if this is it, I would be slightly surprised. But I don't know how many people looking for this rock walked this close to the sand company off a trail. So maybe, I don't know. Okay, I'm literally at the sand company pretty much. I don't know if you can see the pile of sand through the trees 15 feet away from me. And I don't see any no trespassing signs, so I'll just keep walking, I guess. Okay, I'm pretty much at the border of the sand company, and I see a promising rock right there. Even though I think I'm not trespassing, I would still rather not get spotted, which is hard in safety orange. But let's see if we can get a look at this rock. Is that a furrow? Is that a furrow underneath a 4-foot diameter rock? I feel like it could be. I feel like it definitely could be. Very clearly could have been dug out here. Okay, can you see the sand company in the truck? Okay, good. Let's get out of here. You know, I really expected there to be like a fence or a sign that says don't go past this point. This one is a little promising. Also, right on the border of the company. That kind of looks like a furrow. That definitely looks like a furrow. Kind of harder to tell here. Oh wait, no, that's that's furrowy. That's furrowy for sure. That goes in deep. That's for sure furrowy. Same over here. I'm pretty much traversing this forest by going from boulder to boulder. There's the next one. Time to start walking in that direction. Oh! Hit record and immediately fell down. Alright, here's another stone wall. I guess that's a good sign. Although I'm beginning to think that this ain't gonna happen. Looking for a rock. Just one rock out of 10,000 rocks. You wanna see a furrow? You wanna see a furrow? I'll show you a furrow. Where's that dang rock? Oh my lord, check this out. So I've been mostly trying to stay off the trails because like I said, I think the rock is probably not real close to a trail, but I just decided to give the trails a shot, and there's a lot of bike paths around here. And so I've been walking on a bike path, and I found this little sanctuary. This is awesome. Check this out. There's a mailbox here with a bunch of stickers and some candy for me to enjoy, and some binoculars and a trail log. Not gonna open that trash can. And then they got this little sitting hammock to look over the cliff here, and these very nice chairs, along with this cute little pink bicycle on a pole. How nice is that? No idea this was here. I got some sour Skittles. All right, here we go. Major obvious evidence that there used to be a structure here. We got this foundation, this stone foundation of some kind of dwelling that isn't here anymore. Check that out. Clearly a cellar hole. Clearly there used to be something here. So I feel like we gotta check pretty thoroughly around here. There's a rock in the woods, just a little ways from the foundation. Don't know that I would call that a furrow. Maybe. All right, lots of rocks in this very thick pine forest here, but nothing that jumps out at me as clearly witch rock, or even a candidate for witch rock, unfortunately. You know, I'm beginning to think that this may in fact be an impossible task. I just don't, you know, the more I look at these rocks, the less and less likely it seems that there's going to be one that just has some very obvious trench around it that somehow persisted for over 300 years. And look at that. Here's a 4-foot rock that's got a lot of space around it. Is that witch rock? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. Here's another rock that I mashed through about 100 feet of little pine trees to get to because I spotted it barely through the woods. And yeah, maybe that's a furrow. It's witch rock, everybody. It's witch rock. I got it. It's witch rock. It's witch rock. Look at that. You can't tell me that's not a furrow, and that's 4 feet across. Ooh, got it, everybody. I got it. I found it. I got witch rock. Yeah. Yeah, everybody. Ah, look at me. Look at how dirty I am from tromping through mud and sticks and leaves. You know, the more I think about it, the more kind of silly it was for me to think I had all that much of a chance of finding this rock, to be honest. Because I've been walking around Hopkins Hill, but in the neighborhood of Hopkins Hill could really mean, I don't know, anything within a couple miles of Hopkins Hill, really. Plus, like I already been saying, I'm looking for a furrow around a boulder, and that's really my only indication. A 4-foot boulder with a trench around it. So if you're watching this video and you think you might be able to find witch rock and succeed where I failed, more power to you. Because I definitely still had a good time walking around out here looking, even if I didn't find the rock.
Oh my god, everybody, I found it. Look, witch's rock with a huge trench around it. Holy cow, that's it. You know what? I spent so much time finding this baby, I just can't leave it here. I gotta take it home with me.